Alright guys, this is another BronyDan Talks Doctor Who episode, and I thought for this episode, because of the recent news, like if you're in the Doctor Who community, you'll remember of course that a few weeks ago Terrance Dicks passed away at the age of 84, and for those of you who aren't really in the know as much about Doctor Who, Terrance Dicks was like one of the last great Doctor Who living legends. He had acted as script editor from 1968 to 1974. He came up with several ideas and concepts that we sort of know today with Doctor Who, like the Master and the Time Lords. He wrote a couple of the stories for the series, including the War Games, Robot, State of Decay, and the Five Doctors, which was the 20th anniversary special, and like I want to say Brain of Morbius as well, because he technically originally wrote that story, but considering how much was ended up being changed and his insistence of having his name taken off it, that's completely debatable on whether or not that should count as an actual Terrance Dicks story. And he also was responsible for the Target novelizations, which were, you know, the novelizations of certain Doctor Who stories, and he did write a good chunk of them, while, and of course, whereas some of the other writers of the original stories would come in and pen their own versions. And obviously for this episode, we're going to look at a Terrance Dicks story, and what is probably my favourite of his, which is Horror of Fang Rock. So Horror of Fang Rock is the first story of season 15, so it's the first story in which Graham Williams is acting as producer after Philip Hinchcliffe had effectively been kicked off after the controversial episode 3 cliffhanger to Deadly Assassin, and Williams was basically brought in to try and lighten up the show a bit, which he eventually would do. But at this point, Robert Holmes is still acting as script editor, so this story feels like it would be more at home during the Hinchcliffe-Holmes era than it would, say, what Graham Williams would later have in his era of the show. So the plot for this story is that the Doctor and Leela, at this time is his companion, they basically end up getting trapped on a lighthouse in, I think if I can remember, it's the early 1900s. They get stuck on a lighthouse with like the lighthouse keeper and a shipwrecked crew. And at the same time, there is an alien presence outside the lighthouse that wants to try and get in, and it's a whole conspiracy, and it's a whole mystery on whether or not is the alien actually inside, and what does it actually want. And I think, honestly, this is a really well-written story. It's quite claustrophobic in a way. It's like it follows like a typical like Base Under Siege type of story, and like I said, it's claustrophobic because a lighthouse is a very remote place to be in. There's nowhere you can escape from, and I think that's one of the interesting strengths to find with Horror of Fang Rock, because like I don't know if I'm going to be spoiling anything for this, but this is one of the rare stories in Doctor Who where everybody dies. Like none of the supporting characters make it out of this story alive. Everyone pretty much dies a rather horrific death, whether it's from the like electrocutions from the alien, or like in one case being pulled off the top of the lighthouse gantry and pretty much just falling to your death. It is a huge, like I said, even though there's like, I think like 7 or 8 members of the supporting cast in the show, like, for the fact to kill every single one of them off, I think is a real testament of, like, this is serious. Not even, like, I try to think of what other story would try, like not even War Games, for example, which is all about war and all of that. Not even that killed off all the characters. Tom Baker is on full form in this story. He is completely, like, he plays all the gamuts that you'd expect from his Doctor. At some points he can be, you know, quite silly and goofy, whereas when other times he can be completely serious and he takes control of the situation. And I think he has, for me, I think one of my favourite, like, cliffhanger moments, which is at the end of episode 3, when they think that they've locked the alien out of the lighthouse, and then suddenly, through a realization at the end, the Doctor then suddenly realizes, like, he says the line, "I've made a terrible mistake. I thought I locked the alien outside, but I've locked it in here with us." I think the way Tom delivers that line is just, it's chilling, because I don't think it's rarely do you see the Doctor realise, oh my god, I've just made a huge error that could probably kill us all. The rest of the cast as well, I think, are really good. I think Louise Jameson by this point is really getting into Leela, and I think this is a story where, like, she and Tom's relationship sort of got better, because when Louise joined the TARDIS crew, Tom wasn't particularly fond of her. He didn't like the character of Leela because I think he was still, like, lamenting the loss of Elizabeth Sladen, and he apparently wasn't really that nice to her, and especially during, like, this story, apparently, he kept talking over her dialogue and stepping over her until eventually she just stood her ground and just said, "Oi, Tom, fuck off. I'm doing my thing. Can you just let me do it?" And at that point, he just thought, okay, I respect you now for standing up to me. And from then on, I think their friendship just got better. And they're still good friends now, actually. But like I said, she does a really good job as well. And, like, again, some of the cast, like the cast as well, I think does a really good job. I think one of my favourites is Colin Douglas, who plays Reuben, because I think he played Bruce in The Enemy of the World with Patrick Troughton, and he does a really good job as well, playing the gruff old, like, lighthouse keeper, and eventually he ends up playing the alien in a way. And, you know, like some of the other characters, like Vince and Ben, and like even some of the crew who get shipwrecked are all these upper class, like they're all played really well. Like Lord Palmerdale is good, Adelaide is played really well, and I think the characters that you kind of think, I kind of want them to die because they're just such pricks. Except for the Colonel, I was really upset when the Colonel got killed at the end, because I actually did like him. But of course, the big reveal at the end of the story about what the alien is that it's a Rutan. And of course, if you know Doctor Who lore, you'll of course hear that word a couple of times when it's related to the Sontarans, because obviously we all know about the famous war between the Sontarans and the Rutans. We hear it all the time whenever the Sontarans pop up. And, like, this was the only time we actually ever see a Rutan on screen. And if I can remember correctly, I think it is the only time where it's kind of mentioned in which the Sontarans are actually winning this time. Because every time I think I've seen the Sontarans, it's like either the war's going bad for them or they're, like, at a stalemate. This is the one time where the Doctor's like, you're finally losing that interminable war with the Sontarans. I like the idea of the fact that, you know, the Sontarans are all this militarized, cloned species, while the Rutans they're basically alien jellyfish with shape-shifting powers. it's such an interesting, it's a cool contrast to the Sontarans. And I think the whole idea of them being, like, yeah, and the whole point of it being a Rutan was apparently an inside joke between Terrance Dicks and Robert Holmes, because when Terrance Dicks was script editor and he wanted Bob Holmes to write the Time Warrior, which was of course the first story to introduce the Sontarans, Bob was basically saying, you know, Terrance, I don't want to write that story. I hate history. I hate, you know, stuff about castles. I don't know anything about it. And Terrance had basically said to him, well, go to your local library and find a kid's book on castles. And when it came to this story, pretty much the same thing had happened again. Bob wanted a story set in a lighthouse, and Terrance was like, but Bob, I don't know anything about lighthouses or anything. And Bob said the exact same thing. Well, go to your local library and find a kid's book on lighthouses. And I think Terrance remembered that conversation, and what came from that story was the Sontarans, and he just thought, well, okay then, let's make it a Rutan. In fact, in some ways it kind of feels like a little bit like the Time War in some ways, because the Rutan crash lands, and the whole point of the story is that it's trying to contact its mothership, just to say, like, you know, hey, I'm here, can you pick me up? And at the same time, can we destroy this planet, in a way? Which is kind of like what Lynx was trying to do. Like he was saying, like, I have to return to the war. I need to repair my ship. I need to, you know, and get back to the war. It's kind of the same thing in a way, but it's done in a different way so that it doesn't, you know, feel like a copy. Because it could have felt like a copy, but at the same time, the way it's written, and especially the atmosphere around it, it feels completely different. And it is probably one of the darkest stories to come out, especially during the Tom Baker era. Now, there are some, like I will say, moments where you're just like, oh, that's a little bit silly, particularly some outside scenes where, like, you've got the Rutan, like, climbing the side of the lighthouse, or a classic shot of the Doctor hanging off of the windowsill outside the lighthouse. You look at those, and you just think, oh, okay, that's a little bit dodgy. It's dodgy, but like I said, that doesn't really hamper my enjoyment for the story. And like and again, I think this is a really well written story. It's brilliantly acted. It's wonderfully directed by, I'm trying to think, was it Paddy Russell who directed this story? Hang on, let me check. Brilliantly directed by Paddy Russell. I think she directed a few good stories as well. So all in all, I think this is just a really well put together story. It's dark, it's creepy, it's atmospheric, it's brilliantly claustrophobic. It does kind of remind me of Alien. And like I said, it's a well-written story, and I think, for me personally, this is probably my favourite Doctor Who story that Terrance Dicks wrote, in terms of, like, what he actually did himself personally. I couldn't choose, like, any story that he had done whilst as script editor, because I think I'm looking at, like, the entirety of the Jon Pertwee era, and it's very hard to pick from that. Because I always say the golden age of Doctor Who, people always say, is Tom Baker's first 3 seasons. I always say the golden age was from the start of Jon Pertwee's era to the end of Tom's 3rd season. Those, like, 7, try to think, was it 7? Yeah, those 7 seasons, I think, are just quintessential Doctor Who. And really, that was all down to Terrance and his joint partnership with Barry Letts, and of course his bringing on Robert Holmes to take over as his successor as a script editor, as well as bringing him on as a writer in the first place back in the 60s. So yeah, like I said, I highly recommend Horror of Fang Rock. It's a brilliant example of really creepy Doctor Who, and we wouldn't have it any other way, especially coming from a well-loved member of the Doctor Who production team. So, that's all I gotta say. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and rest in peace, Terrance Dicks.